The 90-pound military K9 crossed the hospital ward in under 2 seconds, teeth exposed, chain rattling, a blur of muscle and training that had taken down armed combatants in 3 countries. 6 Navy SEALs stood frozen along the wall. Every nurse in the corridor pressed against the far door. Nobody breathed. The only person who didn't move was the woman in the white scrubs standing directly in the dog's path. She dropped to one knee. She said 4 words. 4 words that had never appeared in any public military document. 4 words that should have been buried under 6 years of classified reports and sealed files. The dog stopped. Then it pressed its entire head against her chest and trembled. Before the story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that don't make headlines finally get told. Every single week, we bring you cinematic narratives about ordinary people who carry extraordinary weight in silence. Hit the like button if this one already has your attention, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Coastal Pines Military Medical Center sat 6 miles from the Virginia waterfront, on a stretch of government land that smelled like salt water and jet fuel, depending on which way the wind was blowing. It was not a glamorous facility. The halls were pale green linoleum and fluorescent light. The waiting room chairs had seen better decades. The coffee from the staff machine tasted like hot cardboard, and everyone drank it anyway because the alternative was being awake without it. Nora Callahan had worked there for 3 years. She was 32 years old, white, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned back so tightly it pulled at her temples by the end of a shift. Her badge said Critical Care on. Her assignment that Tuesday morning was Ward 7, the post-surgical recovery unit for active duty personnel, which meant she was responsible for 6 patients ranging from a Marine with a shattered femur to a special operations officer who refused to tell anyone how he'd gotten the wound in his left side. Quiet at work. Not cold, she answered questions directly. She remembered which patients took their pain medication late because they were too proud to ask for it. On time, she knew which family members needed a chair and a cup of water before they got the news. But she did not volunteer information about herself. She did not linger at the nurse's station trading stories. Clocked in. She did the work. She clocked out. And she went home to her apartment, where the only personal decoration was a photograph she kept turned face down on the kitchen counter. The senior charge nurse, Deborah Flagg, had once asked her in the break room whether she'd done military service before nursing school. Nora had looked at her for a moment, then said, "Why do you ask?" "The way you move," Deborah said. "You don't startle." Nora poured her coffee and said, "I grew up with loud siblings." That had been the end of it. Tuesday started like every other Tuesday. She checked vitals on arrival. She reviewed the overnight notes. The Marine in bed 3 had developed a low-grade fever that needed to be monitored. The officer in bed 5, Lieutenant Commander something, the chart had a redaction on it, had finally agreed to eat solid food, which was progress after 4 days of nutritional supplements and what Nora had privately categorized as deliberate stubbornness. She changed 2 dressings, fielded a call from a family member asking questions she wasn't authorized to answer, and was in the middle of updating a medication log when she heard the elevator at the end of the hall. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of a working military dog is different from a pet. It's not barking, not whining. Controlled pressure, the click of nails against tile, the soft exhale through a muzzle, the specific weight of an animal that has been trained to contain itself and knows the difference between containment and restraint. Nora had worked alongside military K9 units during her time in the Navy, and she recognized that sound the same way she recognized the smell of antiseptic or the rhythm of a cardiac monitor going wrong. She looked up. 6 men came through the ward doors first. All of them in Navy working uniforms, fit in the particular dense way that came from years of operational training rather than gym vanity, moving with the unconscious coordination of a unit that had spent years in close quarters. One of them, the one at the front, broad-shouldered with close-cut dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete, was holding the leash. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, 90 pounds at minimum, with a tactical vest still buckled around its chest. It scanned the room as it walked in the way that trained animals do, not nervously, not excitedly, but systematically, the way a professional sweeps a space before committing to it. Nora watched them from the nurse's station. The man with the leash, she would learn his name shortly, though she already suspected it, stopped at the desk and spoke to the ward clerk, 23-year-old named Marcus, who genuinely had not expected his Tuesday to involve a military working dog. "We're here to see Captain Wilder," the man said. His voice was flat. Not unfriendly, exactly. Just stripped of anything unnecessary. Marcus checked the screen. "Captain Wilder's in room 704. Down the hall, second to last on the left. But I should let the charge nurse know you're..." "Fine." He was already moving. Nora returned to her medication log. She was pulling the next chart when she heard the sound shift. It was subtle. The dog's breathing changed. Not agitated, not alarmed. Something else. A recognition sound. A low register she had heard exactly twice in her life, both times in very specific circumstances that she had spent 6 years trying not to think about. She went still. Then she made the mistake of looking up. The dog was looking directly at her. 90 pounds of military-trained animal, and it was staring at her with an intensity that stopped the ward clerk mid-sentence. The man at the leash looked where the dog was looking, and his face did something complicated in the space of about 2 seconds. Recognition, then confusion, then something that went cold very fast. He read her name badge. "Callahan," he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Nora set the chart down carefully. "Can I help you?" "You were at Ironvale." It came out low and precise, the way an accusation does when it's been rehearsed. So many times it has worn a groove. The other 5 SEALs went still. Nora held his gaze. "Sir, this is a recovery ward. If you'd like to speak with me, we can step into the hallway. I'll speak with you right here." "That's not appropriate in front of you." "Was your name on the Ironvale extraction report, or wasn't it?" Her jaw tightened. Around her, she was aware of Marcus frozen at the desk, of 2 other nurses who had appeared in the doorway, and were now reconsidering whether to walk through it. The patients in the nearest rooms had privacy curtains, but curtains didn't block sound. "We are not doing this here," she said, keeping her voice flat and professional, even though something in her chest had gone very tight. "My brother's name was Specialist Damon Rourke," the man said, and his voice cracked on the last syllable in a way that he clearly hadn't intended, because his expression immediately hardened again to compensate. "He was in that building when you got on the helicopter." The ward went completely quiet. Nora did not look away. "I know who Damon Rourke was." "Then you know what you did." "Chief," one of the other SEALs stepped forward, putting a hand on the man's arm. He shook it off. His name, she would confirm later, was Seth Rourke, 36 years old. Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer. 8 years in the teams. 2 tours and environments she had also been in, though in very different capacities. He had a service record that was mostly classified, and a face that showed everything his file didn't. The particular erosion that happened to people who carried grief so long it calcified into something they could function around, but never passed. She had seen that face before. Not on him. In a mirror approximately 6 years ago, when she'd come back to the ship without the man she'd gone back in for. "Chief Rourke," she said, and the name landed visibly. He hadn't expected her to know it. "I understand that you have questions. I understand that you have every right to your anger. But I'm asking you, right now, to step into the hallway with me so we can have this conversation without frightening patients who are recovering from surgery. I'm not interested in your request. I'm not making a request. I'm telling you that this is not inappropriate." 6 years, he said, cutting through her. 6 years I've been looking at that report. 6 years it says Specialist Rourke remained inside a collapsing structure while the attached medical officer evacuated with wounded personnel and 1 military K9. That's what it says. Right there in black ink with your name next to it. He took a step toward her. Threatening, exactly. But not threatening. "So tell me what I'm reading wrong." The dog made a sound. It wasn't a growl. It was something quieter than that, a low note in the back of its throat, and it was looking directly at Nora, not with aggression, but with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Nora's eyes went to the animal and stayed there for a half-second longer than they should have. Seth Rourke noticed. "You know, Rex," he said slowly. "Step into the hallway with me." "How do you know my dog?" Marcus had quietly picked up the phone at the desk. She could see him dialing in her peripheral vision, probably calling security or the duty officer or both. She needed to de-escalate this before it became a formal incident, because a formal incident would generate paperwork, and paperwork would mean questions. And questions would mean a conversation she was not prepared to have in this building on this Tuesday morning. "Chief Rourke," she said very quietly. "Please." Something in that word, the plainness of it maybe, or the fact that she wasn't backing away from him despite the 6 inches and 70 pounds he had on her, made him pause. Then Rex moved. She didn't see it coming, and she suspected from the sharp intake of breath behind her that the seals didn't either. The dog simply shifted its weight, and then it was moving, not charging, not attacking, not the explosive launch of a trained canine responding to a command. Rex crossed the 7 feet between them with the focused intent of an animal that had made a decision, and Nora dropped to one knee on pure instinct because she knew somewhere below rational thought, in the operational layer of her brain, that still remembered things her civilian life had tried to bury, that she needed to be at eye level. Rex stopped 2 inches from her face, then pressed his entire head against her sternum. The ward was silent. Someone down the hall had dropped something metal. Nobody moved to pick it up. Nora put both hands along the sides of Rex's jaw, and the dog made a sound that no one in the room would have described as anything other than grief. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey, I know." Seth Rourke was staring at her. "How does he know you?" he said. Not a question this time. Something else. Nora stayed where she was, Rex's weight pressing against her. Her voice, when she spoke, came out very low. What phrase does Rex respond to when he won't release a bite? The question was so specific and so unexpected that Seth didn't answer for a full 3 seconds. "Classified. I know it's classified. I'm the one who knows it." Another silence. Longer. "Say it," Seth said. She looked up at him. "Anchor holds. Stand easy." The color left his face. That was when one of the other SEALs, the one who had tried to intervene earlier, a younger man with a scar along his chin, said very quietly, "Chief, nobody outside the team knows that." "I know," Seth said. He wasn't looking at the other man. He was looking at Nora. "I know." Rex lifted his head from her chest and turned to look at Seth with the patient, attentive quality of an animal, waiting to understand what would happen next. Nora slowly rose from her knee. Her left leg ached from the cold floor, a small human inconvenience in the middle of something that was becoming very large very fast. "I need to tell you something about Rex," she said. "You don't get to." "He's favoring his left front leg." She said it without inflection. "Clinically. He has been since you walked in. Watch him stand." Nobody wanted to look at the dog. They were all watching her. But after a moment, Seth's eyes dropped to Rex, and she watched him register it, the slight shift of weight, the way Rex had repositioned his left leg twice in the last minute without being asked, favoring the right. "He had a check last month," Seth said. "He's fine. Compensating. If you look at the shoulder, there's swelling under the old scar tissue." She hadn't moved closer. She was describing what she could see from where she stood, and the fact that she could see it from where she stood said something that nobody in the room had fully processed yet. "When did the scar heal?" Seth's jaw worked. "Before I got him. Came to me after Ironvale." Nora went still. "After Ironvale," she repeated. "He was reassigned when the handler was—" Seth stopped. Something moved across his face that wasn't anger, wasn't grief. It was more like the sensation of standing on ground that had just told you it wasn't as solid as it looked. "Rex wasn't at Ironvale," Nora said. "I was. I know what happened to his shoulder." She held Seth's gaze. "And I know why no one wanted to put it in the report." Down the hall, a monitor alarmed briefly and then silenced. Normal, routine. The sounds of a recovery ward doing its ordinary work while something extraordinary sat in the middle of Ward 7 and waited for someone to make the next move. Seth Rourke took one step toward her, not threatening this time. Anger was still there, but it had shifted into something more complicated, the way a storm looks different when you're close enough to see that it's also bringing rain you might actually need. "Then tell me," he said. "Not here," Nora said, "and not today. Today, Rex needs to be seen by veterinary first. Look at his leg, Chief. Look at it right now, and tell me that's a compensating gait from a healed injury." He looked. He stood there, and he looked at his dog with the careful attention of someone who had spent years reading an animal's body language the way other people read words on a page. And she watched the moment he saw it, the real weight shift, the way Rex's breathing had shallowed slightly, the old scar tissue that was raised in a way it hadn't been 2 weeks ago. "Rex," he said, the dog's name quietly. Rex turned to look at him with absolute trust. Seth's hands closed at his sides. "What's in his shoulder?" he said. Nora answered without hesitation. "I don't know for certain, but I know what was in the area when his original wound happened. And if I'm right about what I think I'm seeing, you need imaging done today, not next week. Today." The youngest SEAL in the group barely looked 25, had been wide-eyed since Rex pressed against Nora's chest cleared his throat. Chief, she's not wrong about the gate. Seth didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, if this is some kind of— It isn't, Nora said. I've been trying to avoid this conversation for 3 years, since I started working here. I'm not engineering it. Something in that the weariness in it, the specific weight of someone telling the truth, not because they want to, but because the alternative has run out, seemed to reach him. How do you know the recall phrase? He said. One more time. Quieter now. Nora looked at Rex. Rex looked back at her with those amber eyes that had been trained to assess threats and were currently doing something more complicated than that. Your brother taught it to me, she said. The ward held its breath. Seth Rourke's face did something she hadn't expected. Not rage. Not the controlled fury she'd braced for. Something that cracked, very briefly, somewhere behind his eyes, the way ice fractures before it gives the sound, happening before the break becomes visible. He stood there with that fracture moving through him, and Rex moved quietly to his side and pressed against his knee without being commanded. And for 3 seconds, the entire ward existed, in a silence that was the loudest thing Nora had heard in 6 years. Then Seth Rourke looked at her and said very quietly, "You have 1 hour. Then I want everything." Nora Callahan looked back at the man who had every reason to hate her and said, "Get Rex to imaging first. Then we'll talk." Outside the ward windows, the Virginia sky had gone the color of old pewter, the kind of overcast that sat low and heavy and didn't decide between rain and clearing. Rex pressed harder against Seth's knee, and Nora picked up the phone to call the veterinary unit downstairs. And somewhere in the architecture of all the things that hadn't been said yet, a story that had been locked inside a classified file for 6 years began very slowly to move toward the surface. The veterinary unit was 2 floors down, in the basement level that smelled like antiseptic and animal fur, and the particular kind of institutional cleanliness that never quite covered what was underneath it. Nora made the call from the ward phone, while Seth stood 6 feet away and watched her with the focused stillness of someone who had decided to wait but hadn't decided to trust. Rex sat between them with his weight shifted to his right side, and the longer Nora watched that compensating stance, the more certain she became that she was right about what she was seeing. The on-call veterinary technician, a young woman named Priya who had the efficient manner of someone perpetually understaffed, said she could take Rex in 40 minutes. 20, Nora said. A pause. That's not really. He's a military working dog, presenting with a gait change and swelling at an old injury site. 20 minutes. Another pause. Shorter, okay. 20. Nora hung up and looked at Seth. Basement level. They'll take him in 20 minutes. You don't have clearance to make decisions about my K9. I made a phone call. You can make a different one if you want. She picked up the chart she'd set down 9 minutes ago, which felt like a different geological era. I have 2 patients who need medication checks. When Rex is in imaging, we'll talk. We'll talk now. No, she said it without heat, without apology. We won't, because what I have to tell you is going to require your full attention and a room with a closed door, and right now you're running on 6 years of anger and a dog who's in pain, and you're not going to hear half of what I say. She looked at him directly. I've waited 6 years. You can wait 40 minutes. He didn't like it. She could see that clearly, the set of his jaw, the controlled exhale. But he also didn't argue, which told her something about him that the anger had been obscuring. He was underneath everything, a man who could recognize when someone was being precise rather than evasive. It didn't make him trust her, but it made him wait. She did her medication checks. She updated the fever note on the Marine in bed 3. She did not think about Seth Rourke standing in the hallway or the way Rex had pressed against her chest, because if she let herself think about that, she would not be able to do her job, and her job was the one thing she had maintained with complete consistency for 6 years, regardless of what was happening in the spaces around it. At 17 minutes, she found Marcus at the desk and told him she was taking a 30-minute personal break. Marcus looked at her, looked at the hallway where Seth and his team had congregated near the elevator, and said, "You okay?" "Fine," she said. "Page me if the Marine's temp goes above 38.5. She wasn't fine, but that was a problem for later. The walk to the basement took 4 minutes. Seth fell into step beside her without being invited, Rex on his left, the rest of the team trailing at a distance that suggested they'd been given a silent signal to hang back. In the elevator, nobody spoke. Rex sat between Nora and Seth and looked at the doors, with the patient attention of an animal that had learned to endure confined spaces without complaint. Nora looked at Rex's shoulder. The swelling was subtle, you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. If you didn't know the specific geography of what an old wound looked like versus one that had been disturbed from the inside. She had seen that particular presentation twice in her career. First time, she hadn't known what it meant. The second time, she had. Priya met them at the veterinary unit door with the clipped efficiency of someone who had reorganized her entire morning to make 20 minutes work. She ran her hands along Rex's leg and shoulder with professional focus, asked Seth 3 questions about timeline and behavior, and then looked at Nora with an expression that was curious but appropriately restrained. "You're the one who called?" "Yes." "What are you seeing?" "Swelling proximal to the old scar. Gait compensation that started in the last few weeks based on the muscle pattern. There's a foreign body involved. It's been mobile." Nora paused. "I'd want to see the original injury documentation, if you can pull it." Priya looked at Seth. He looked at Nora. Then after a moment he nodded at Priya. "Pull it," he said. They left Rex with Priya and a technician, and Seth stood outside the closed door, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. 2 of his team had followed them down and positioned themselves near the stairwell with the casual stance of men, pretending not to be standing guard. Nora leaned against the opposite wall and waited. "How long have you been at Coastal Pines?" Seth said finally. 3 years. "And before that?" "Civilian trauma unit in Raleigh." "Before that?" "Discharge processing and transition to nursing school." She watched him take that in. "I left active duty 14 months after Ironvale." "Voluntary separation." "Yes." He looked up. "Why?" It was a harder question than it sounded, and they both knew it. Nora considered how to answer it, not dishonestly, not evasively, but accurately. There was a version of the truth that was clean and brief and would mean nothing. There was a version that would mean too much for a hallway outside a veterinary unit, because the job I'd done stopped being the job I'd been doing, she said. And I didn't know how to explain that without explaining things I wasn't cleared to explain. Seth was quiet for a moment. "Damon talked about you." The sentence landed like something dropped from a height. Nora kept her face still, but her hands at her sides pressed flat against the wall behind her. "He said you were the best trauma operator he'd worked with," Seth continued. His voice was rough on it. "Said you didn't waste motion, that you knew what mattered." A pause. "He said it the week before Ironvale." "I know," Nora said. "He told me he'd said it." Seth's head came up sharply. "We talked the night before the extraction," she said. "He knew the building was unstable. He'd seen the structural assessment. He didn't tell the team because..." She stopped. "Not in a hallway. Tell me right now." "Seth." She used his first name without deciding to, and it surprised them both. "I will tell you everything. I will tell you things that are in sealed files that I'm probably not legally supposed to tell you. But I need you sitting down, not standing in a basement corridor, running on 4 hours of sleep and 6 years of..." She caught herself. "Please." The please did something. Same as it had upstairs. He wasn't a man who softened easily or often. That was clear. The anger had too much structural integrity to it, had been load-bearing for too long. But the please reached something underneath the structure. He looked at the closed veterinary door. "After Rex," he said. "After Rex," she agreed. The imaging took 50 minutes rather than the projected 30, which Nora spent sitting in a row of plastic chairs outside the unit, doing what she always did when she had nothing to do with her hands running through patient vitals in her head, rechecking her medication schedule, the small repetitive acts of a person who had learned that stillness was dangerous. Seth sat 2 chairs away and didn't speak. His team had disappeared somewhere. Just the 2 of them in that basement hallway, with the hum of equipment behind the walls, and the faint antiseptic smell and the distant sound of the facility doing its ordinary work 6 stories above. At one point Seth said, without preamble, "The report said you evacuated with 2 critically wounded and the K9, and that Specialist Rourke was determined to be non-recoverable based on structural collapse assessment. I know what the report says. It has your signature on the evacuation confirmation." "I know." "So you signed off on leaving him?" Nora turned to look at him. "I signed off on evacuating the wounded personnel and Rex as ordered." "Those are different things, are they?" "Yes, they are." She held his gaze. "Seth, I know you've read that report so many times the language lives in your head. I know what it sounds like. But a signature on an evacuation confirmation is not the same as a signature on an abandonment. And the people who wrote that report knew exactly what they were doing when they chose that framing." Something shifted in his expression. "Not belief, not yet." but the first crack in the certainty that had been holding the anger in its shape for 6 years. "Who wrote the report?" he said. "The operation commander, Colonel Briggs Halverson." She watched his face. "You know that name. Halverson retired 2 years ago with a commendation." "I know. You're saying he—" The veterinary door opened. Priya came out with a tablet in her hand and an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that meant she was working to keep it that way. She looked at Seth. "I need to show you something," she said. They went back in. Rex was lying on the examination table with the patient tolerance of a well-trained animal, and the technician was monitoring his vitals while Priya pulled up the imaging on the wall screen. The image was a standard radiographic scan, the kind that showed bone and dense tissue in white and gray gradients. And for a moment, Nora just looked at the overall picture, the shoulder joint, the old healed fracture in the scapular region, the surrounding tissue. Then she saw it. It was small, 11 millimeters at its widest point, irregular edges sitting in the soft tissue below the old scar, and approximately 2 centimeters from the shoulder joint capsule. It had the density signature of metal. That, Priya said, pointing with her stylus, was not in his file from the pre-adoption screening. Seth was very still. "How long has it been there?" he said. "On the tissue encapsulation, I'd estimate years. 5-6 minimum." Priya glanced at Nora, then back at Seth. "Been stable until recently. The new swelling suggests it shifted, possibly in the last 4 to 6 weeks." "What is it?" Seth said. Priya looked at Nora again. Nora looked at the image. The shape, the density, the location. She had been in a collapsing building 6 years ago, in the dark, with dust and debris coming down and 2 men screaming, and a dog pressed against a man who was telling her to go. She knew exactly what had been in that building. She knew the sound it made when structural reinforcement gave way. She knew what kind of debris field it left. "It's a fragment," she said. "Concrete reinforcement wire. The kind used in the East Wing structure at Ironvale." She paused. He was standing next to Damon when the first collapse happened. This went in then. The room was very quiet. Seth looked at the image on the screen for a long time. Rex lifted his head from the table and looked at Seth, with those amber eyes, steady and patient, and the fragment on the screen sat in his shoulder like a 6-year-old piece of evidence that nobody had thought to look for. "He's been carrying it since Ironvale," Seth said. "Yes." Seth's hand came up to the side of his face. A gesture Nora had not seen from him yet, something involuntary, something that slipped through the controlled exterior. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple and stood there, with his eyes on the dog and the image and the years between them. "It needs to come out," Priya said quietly. "It's close enough to the joint that if it shifts any further, it could cause serious damage. We'd need to schedule surgery." "When?" Seth said. "I can do it tomorrow morning if you authorize it today." Authorize it." He turned away from the screen. He was looking at the wall when he spoke again, not at Nora, not at Rex, just at the pale institutional surface. "Carried that thing for 6 years. Yes," Nora said, "and nobody found it. Nobody was looking in the right place." Pause. "Story of Ironvale," he said. They went upstairs. Seth had his team directed to a family consultation room that Nora borrowed from the charge nurse with a look that discouraged questions. It was a small room, 4 chairs, a round table, a window that looked onto a concrete service wall. Seth took the chair nearest the door. Old habit, probably. The chair with the sight line to the exit. Nora sat across from him and put her hands on the table and told him, not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it, the actual structure of what had happened at Ironvale 6 years ago, the version that did not appear in any report she had ever been allowed to sign her name to. She told him that the building had been a 2-story reinforced concrete structure on the western edge of a cleared zone, and that the structural assessment Damon had seen that she had seen had rated it as compromised before the team even entered. She told him that the operation commander had known this and had proceeded anyway, because the intelligence target inside had a 6-hour extraction window that he did not want to lose. She told him that when the first collapse happened and the second floor partially gave way, Damon had been in the interior stairwell with Rex and 2 younger operators, Specialist Tam Nguyen and Brody Walsh, both of whom had been hit by debris. Nguyen had a fractured pelvis. Walsh had a penetrating chest wound. Both were critical. She told him that the extraction helicopter had a weight and space limitation that had been precise to the pound, and that Damon had known this before the team went in because he had done the math himself that morning. She told him that when she reached Damon in that stairwell with the ceiling coming down in stages and the dust so thick she'd navigated by sound and the pressure of Rex against her leg, Damon had been conscious, alert. He had looked at her and looked at Nguyen and Walsh and looked at the helicopter wait on the extraction confirmation, and he had done the math again in about 4 seconds. He knew, Seth said. Yes. Before you reached him. Yes, he already knew. She kept her voice level. He told me to take Nguyen and Walsh and Rex and go. He gave me Rex's release command. He said to tell you that the lantern stays lit until you find your way home. Seth's jaw worked. That's not in the report either, he said. No, it isn't. She let that sit. I told him I was coming back. He said okay. He said okay the way you say it to someone when you're trying to give them permission to leave, without making it feel like a goodbye. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the facility hummed along. Somewhere down the hall, a cart went by with the rhythmic squeak of a wheel that needed oil. You went back, Seth said. Not a question. She hadn't told him that yet, and he'd arrived there anyway. I delivered Nguyen and Walsh to the ship. Rex went with them. He was wounded. He needed the medics. She looked at Seth steadily. Then I went back. Silence. That's not in the report, he said. No. Why? Because Colonel Halverson ordered the secondary mission, classified under a separate operational code, the moment I requested the rescue clearance. He didn't want the initial extraction decision reviewed. Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it was not level. I went back with a 4-person volunteer team. We had 90 minutes before enemy forces would close the perimeter. We searched the building for 4.5 hours. Seth's head came up. 4.5 hours, she said again. We violated the withdrawal order by 3 hours. Halverson threatened every person on that team with court-martial if we didn't withdraw. And when we finally did, when the perimeter was so tight, we had no other choice. I filed a formal protest against the operation classification. That protest was also classified. She paused. That's why you've never seen it. That's why the report you read for 6 years looks the way it does. Seth was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. The anger was still there. She didn't expect it to simply dissolve. It had too much history in it for that, but had been joined by something else, something complicated and raw. Halverson, he said, yes. He classified the rescue at tempo. Protect the initial decision to send the team into a compromised structure. It came out that we went back in unauthorized and couldn't find Damon. It opened questions about why command hadn't authorized a formal rescue mission, which opened questions about why the structural assessment had been overridden, which led directly back to him. Seth sat very still. My brother died, he said slowly, because Halverson didn't want the liability. Nora didn't answer. She didn't need to. And you've known this for 6 years. Yes, and you didn't. He stopped. Why didn't you come to us? To the family. To me, I tried. She said it flat and direct. 14 months after Ironvale, I filed a formal grievance with the Inspector General's office. Denied on national security grounds. I hired a private attorney. He received a visit from 2 people who did not identify their agency and advised him against pursuing the case. I wrote 4 letters to Damon's official next of kin. She watched Seth's face. They came back unopened. Return address was your mother's house in Chesapeake. The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier. With a different quality to it, my mother, Seth said. Yes, he was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, confusion first, then a kind of slow and terrible reckoning, the look of a person recalculating a map they'd been navigating for years and finding that the coordinates were wrong. She never mentioned letters, he said. No, Nora said. She wouldn't have. Why are you saying it like that? Nora hesitated. This was the part she had not fully planned for, had hoped, in some buried way, she would not have to reach today. They were here now, sitting in a borrowed consultation room with Rex in surgery downstairs, and 6 years of sealed files between them, and there was no version of the truth that left this part out. About 8 months after Ironvale, she said carefully, I drove to Chesapeake. I went to your mother's house. I knocked on the door. She paused. She answered. She knew who I was. She'd seen my name in the documentation the military provided to the family. Seth was very still. We spoke for about 45 minutes, Nora said. She knew Seth. Not everything she didn't know about the classified rescue mission. She didn't know about Halverson specifically. But she knew the official account had gaps. She knew the report didn't sit right. She kept her voice even. She asked me not to pursue it formally anymore. Why? Because you were destroying yourself. Nora held his gaze. She said you'd re-enlisted to chase what happened to Damon. She said you were pulling every classified string you had access to, calling in every contact, working yourself through 2 combat deployments on pure grief with nowhere to put it. She was afraid that if the formal investigation opened, it would consume you, that it would give you a target to chase so specific that you'd chase it until it killed you. The silence was absolute. Seth Rourke sat across from the woman he had spent 6 years blaming for his brother's death, in a small consultation room with a view of a concrete wall, and the expression on his face was not anger anymore. It was something that hadn't had enough air in 6 years. Something that had been pressed flat for so long, it no longer knew its own shape. She protected me, he said. Yes, from the truth. From one version of the truth, at one specific moment, when she thought the truth would finish what the war had started. Nora paused. I don't know if she was right. I've thought about it a lot. Seth looked at his hands on the table. She died last year, he said. I know. I read the obituary. A pause. I'm sorry. He didn't respond to that. He sat with it the way people sit with things that are too large to process in a single moment and too real to set down. The facility hummed. The cart with the squeaky wheel went back the other direction. Then Seth Rourke said, very quietly, I called you a coward. In front of my team. In front of patients. Yes. In the middle of a hospital ward. Yes. He looked up. The expression on his face was not comfortable. I unleashed Rex. You did. A long, terrible pause. He didn't attack, Seth said. No, she looked at him. He didn't. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when Seth Rourke's phone buzzed on the table between them, and he picked it up, and the color went out of his face in a way that had nothing to do with anything they'd been discussing. He turned the screen toward her. It was a message from Priya in the veterinary unit, 3 lines, and the last line read, Fragment removed successfully. But you need to come down. There's something on it. Engraved. I don't know what it means, but I think you will. They went downstairs at a pace that wasn't quite running, but wasn't walking either. Seth slightly ahead. Nora keeping up without effort. Both of them moving through the basement corridor with the focused momentum of people who had stopped pretending they were doing anything other than what they were doing. Priya met them at the veterinary unit door. She had a stainless steel specimen tray in her hand, lined with a blue surgical drape, and on the drape sat the fragment 11 millimeters, irregular, dark with oxidized metal and the biological residue of 6 years inside living tissue. It had been cleaned enough to see the surface clearly, not enough to disturb whatever was on it. Priya held the tray toward Seth. He looked at the fragment without touching it for a long moment. Then he picked it up between 2 fingers with the careful precision of a man who had handled sensitive materials in field conditions and understood that careful handling was not the same as being afraid. Nora watched his face. The fragment was roughly the size of a thumbnail, twisted at one end from the force of impact, flattened slightly on one face. On that flattened face, scratched into the metal with something sharp and deliberate a tool, a knife edge, anything with a point, were 4 characters. DR7. Seth stood very still. DR, Nora says it quietly. Damon Rourke. I know. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him yet. Lower. Stripped of everything functional. 7 was his operator number in the unit, she said. He scratched that into equipment sometimes. Personal items. To mark, I know what it means. Seth closed his fingers around the fragment. He marked it. Before the collapse, Nora said. Or during it. She stopped. While he was still alive. Seth finished it. Not as a question. The fragment had not been random debris that found Rex's shoulder in the chaos of a structural collapse. Damon Rourke had marked it, which meant he had held it deliberately, at some point in those final minutes in that stairwell, which meant that in the specific time between Nora leaving with Nguyen and Walsh and the ceiling coming down completely, Damon Rourke had done something intentional with a piece of wire and a sharp edge and whatever time he had left. He knew Rex would be recovered, Seth said. He knew Rex would survive, Nora corrected. He didn't know how. He didn't know that the fragment would go in during the collapse. That part wasn't planned. It was the building coming down around both of them. She paused. But I think he marked it because he needed to leave something that was his. Something real, not a report. Seth opened his hand and looked at the fragment again. He left evidence, Seth said. He left proof that he was there and he was alive, and he made choices. Nora looked at the fragment in Seth's palm. He wasn't just a name in a casualty assessment. He was a man who marked a piece of metal in a collapsing building and sent it home the only way he could. The veterinary unit was very quiet. Priya had stepped back toward the examination table where Rex was resting post-surgery. Vitals stable, the incision site dressed cleanly. The technician was monitoring and not looking at them. Both of them were doing the professional thing, which was to be present and invisible. Seth closed his hand around the fragment again. Then he looked at Nora and said, "I need to make a phone call." "I know," she said. "I need to call someone at JAG." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not gratitude. It was too complicated and too early for gratitude, but was something adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged, without being able to fully say it yet, that the version of the last 6 years he'd been living in was not the version that had actually happened. "The grievance you filed with the IG," he said. "You still have the documentation? Every word of it." "I kept copies outside the official system." She paused. "Kept copies of everything." Something moved through his expression. "For 6 years, yes." "You were waiting. I was prepared," she said. "Waiting implies patience." "I wasn't patient. I was just ready. In case the moment came." He nodded once, short and precise, the way he did everything. Then he looked at Rex on the table, and something about the angle of his head, the way he stood, with the fragment still in his closed hand, made him look briefly like a younger man, like someone who had not yet accumulated the specific weight of the last 6 years. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Nora couldn't see the name, but she saw his expression change, the particular tightening that happened when a call was not welcome, but was also not something you could ignore. Stepped away and answered it. Nora moved to Rex's side. She put her hand on the dog's flank and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of him, the realness of him on the table. Rex opened his eyes and looked at her with the amber patience of an animal that did not need the situation explained. "Hey," she said quietly. "You did the hard part." Seth came back into the room 2 minutes later. His face had changed again. The complicated rawness of the last 20 minutes had been packed back down, and in its place was the controlled blank of a man switching back into operational mode. "That was my CO," he said. "Someone on the ward filed a formal complaint, unleashing Rex in a medical facility." He said it without inflection. "I have to go." Nora straightened up from the examination table. "I'll need a formal statement from you about what happened," Seth said. "Yes," she said. "You'll have it. The complaint will go to the duty officer. It'll be on record by end of day." "I know." He paused at the door. He still had the fragment in his hand. He looked at it one more time, and then he put it in his breast pocket, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision about where things belonged. "The JAG call," he said. "That happens today, before the complaint gets processed. It won't matter what order it happens in," Nora said. "Complaint is valid either way. You unleashed Rex in a ward. Whatever comes after doesn't change that." He looked at her for a moment. "I know." "Good," she said. "Because I filed the report 20 minutes ago." The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. Not anger, he didn't have the right to be angry, and somewhere behind his eyes, he knew it. It was more like the particular stillness of a man confronting the exact contour of his own error. "You filed it while we were talking," he said. "Before we came downstairs. I handed the written documentation to Marcus at the desk and asked him to submit it through the duty officer on my behalf." She held his gaze. "I told you I was going to tell you everything. That includes the parts that are difficult. You're filing a complaint against me and then cooperating with my JG contact." "Yes, because the complaint is right and the cooperation is also right. And those two things being simultaneously true is not a contradiction." She kept her voice steady. "Seth, you need the JAG call to protect yourself and to open the Ironvale investigation. You also need the complaint on your record to exist, because if it doesn't, nobody learns that the standard applies even when the reasons are understandable." She paused. Damon would know the difference. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he left. Nora stood in the veterinary unit with Rex breathing steadily on the table and the faint antiseptic smell and the low hum of the baseline monitors, and she pressed one hand against the edge of the examination table and concentrated on keeping her own breathing at a rate that didn't demonstrate anything to the two medical professionals, pretending not to watch her. The next 4 hours were the longest of her working day in recent memory, not because they were dramatic, they weren't. They were the ordinary procedural grind of a busy recovery ward in a military medical facility. Vitals and medications, and a lengthy phone call with a family member who needed the same information explained 4 different ways before they could absorb it, but because they happened, while everything else was also happening. somewhere else in the building, and she was not part of it. Seth Rourke was in a meeting with his commanding officer on the 4th floor. She knew this because Marcus, who had the particular gift of knowing everything that happened in Coastal Pines without appearing to seek any of it out, told her at 1,400 hours, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information he thought she should have. The JAG-G officer arrived at 1,530. Nora knew this because she saw him come through the main entrance, the uniform, the specific kind of briefcase, the purposeful direction. She went back to her medication log. At 1,700, as her shift was ending, she was called to the duty officer's station. Commander Helen Garrett was 51, compact, with the kind of direct manner that had nothing performative in it. She had the complaint documentation on her desk and a second file beside it that Nora recognized as the preliminary JAG inquiry notation. "Down," Garrett said. Nora sat. "You submitted the complaint." "Yes, ma'am." "Against a SEAL chief who was on the ward, visiting a patient. Against a SEAL chief who issued an attack command to a military working dog inside a medical facility in front of staff and patients." She kept her tone even. "The circumstances that preceded it don't change the act." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "You're the nurse the dog refused to attack." "Yes. And you subsequently assisted with the veterinary assessment that led to emergency surgery." "Yes. And you have been here for 3 years without any prior complaints or formal actions." "Yes." Garrett closed the first file and opened the second. The JAG preliminary notation references a classified incident from 6 years ago. Ironvale. "I can't discuss the specifics of a JAG inquiry with you, and I assume you know that." "Yes, ma'am. What I can tell you is that your name appears in that inquiry as a corroborating witness and source of documentary evidence." Garrett looked at her steadily. "Do you understand what that means procedurally?" "It means the investigation is open." "It means the investigation is open," Garrett confirmed, "and that your position here and your cooperation will be relevant to how it proceeds." A pause. "I want to ask you something, Callahan, and I want an honest answer. I'll give you the most honest answer I can. Did you know who Chief Rourke was before this morning?" Nora had known this question was coming. She'd been constructing an honest answer to it for the past 4 hours. "I knew he existed," she said. "I knew Damon had an older brother in the teams. I had no advance knowledge that he would be on this ward today." She paused. "I have been at Coastal Pines for 3 years. It's a military medical facility. The possibility that someone connected to Ironvale would eventually come through was not zero. And I knew that when I took the position." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Why did you take it?" "Because it's the best trauma and critical care facility within 100 miles of where I decided to settle. And because the work here is what I'm trained to do." A pause. "And because I was tired of running from the possibility of this conversation." Garrett closed the second file. She sat back in her chair and looked at Nora with the expression of a woman who had spent enough years in institutional structures to know when someone was telling the truth without ornamentation. "You'll receive a formal notification within 48 hours about your role in the JAG process," she said. "In the meantime, your complaint has been logged and will proceed through standard review. Chief Rourke has been notified of the complaint and is cooperating." She paused. "That's unusual, is it?" Nora said. "Most personnel who receive a formal complaint in the first hour push back on the framing." "He didn't." Nora looked at the desk. "At nothing particular on it." "No," she said, "he wouldn't." She drove home in the gray early evening, through the military-heavy traffic of the coastal corridor, past the shipyard and the commissary and the long flat stretches of government land, and she did not think about Seth Rourke or Damon's initials scratched into a piece of metal, or the JAG officer's briefcase, or any of it. She thought about the Marine in bed 3, whose fever had gone down by end of shift. Thought about what she needed from the grocery store. She thought about whether the weather would clear by the weekend. She was very good at this. She had been doing it for 6 years. At home, she made food she didn't taste. She sat at her kitchen table, and after a long time, she reached across to the photograph on the counter that she kept turned face down, and she turned it over. It was a team photograph. 6 people, desert landscape behind them, taken somewhere that was not identified in the image. Damon Rourke was in the second row, grinning in the specific way of a man who had just survived something and was still running on the adrenaline of it. Rex was at his feet, looking directly at the camera with that amber-eyed focus. Nora was at the far left edge of the frame, not quite smiling, with the slight squint of someone looking into sun. She looked at the photograph for a while, then she put it back down and went to bed. The next morning began at 600, which was standard. She dressed. She drove. She arrived at Coastal Pines with 12 minutes before her shift and used them to get coffee from the machine in the break room that tasted like hot cardboard, which was consistent and therefore reliable. 700. She was in the middle of morning handoff when the charge nurse from overnight, a tired man named Patrick, who communicated primarily in clipped sentences and accurate information, mentioned that there had been an unusual admission to Ward 7 overnight. SEAL operator, he said. Cardiac event during PT. Stable now, but they want monitoring. He handed her the chart. CO is on site, apparently. 4th floor. Nora took the chart and went to check her patient. 830, Seth Rourke appeared in the ward doorway. He was not in uniform. Civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray long-sleeved shirt. He looked like he had slept approximately as much as she had, which was not very much. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner near the facility entrance, the one that was not the machine in the break room. He held one out. She looked at it, then she took it. Rex is doing well, he said. Priya called this morning. He's eating. Good. He stood in the doorway. The JAG contact, his name is Lieutenant Commander Rafferty. He wants a formal recorded statement from you. Today, if possible. I know. He called me at 7 this morning. He's thorough. He is. She looked at Seth over the rim of the coffee cup. How are you? The question surprised him. She could see it land in a way he hadn't anticipated, the specific surprise of someone who has been braced for procedure and logistics and receives instead something direct and human. I don't know yet, he said. Ask me in a week. Fair. He shifted his weight. My CO suspended my operational status pending the complaint review. Standard protocol. A pause. I'm not fighting it. I know. Garrett told me you were cooperating. I gave the attack command. Doesn't matter why. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. The fragment Rafferty wants it as physical evidence. I surrendered it this morning. Something in that word surrendered was heavier than the thing itself. She heard it in the way he said it. That was the right thing, she said. It was Damon's. His jaw tightened, then released. But it's also proof. So she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. In the ward behind her, monitors beeped their ordinary rhythms. A nurse's aide came down the hall with a medication cart and navigated around Seth with the careful deference people gave to large men standing in doorways, regardless of whether those men were technically blocking anything. Statement to Rafferty, Seth said. I told him about Halverson. Told me. I know. Rafferty mentioned it. I also told him about my mother. The sentence cost him something. About the letters. About what she did. Nora looked at him. She was trying to protect you, Nora said. I know. He looked past her into the ward. I've been angry at her for 6 years for not fighting harder for the truth. And she was sitting on the truth to protect me from it. He paused. I don't know what to do with that yet. You don't have to do anything with it yet. I know. He looked at her directly. I owe you an apology. Formal one. In front of my team the same way the accusation was. Nora shook her head slightly. You don't owe me anything in public. You owe me accuracy. You owe me the correct version of the record. She paused. Apology can be private. He nodded once. I'm sorry, Callahan. For all of it. I know, she said. Then her pager went off. Not the low-tone routine alert, the urgent code. The one that meant something had changed fast, in a way that required immediate response. She looked at the display. Ward 7, Room 3. The Marine with the fever. She moved before she finished processing it. The way training replaced thought, in the moment before thought was fast enough. And Seth stepped back without being asked, because he recognized the shift in her, the same way she'd recognized the shift in Rex. She reached room 3 in 40 seconds. The Marine Corporal James Heaton, 24 years old, post-surgical femur repair, now on day 6, was seizing. Not convulsing dramatically. Not the full tonic-clonic presentation that non-medical people pictured. This was the quieter, more dangerous kind. A focal seizure, moving into something larger, his eyes tracking wrong. His left arm in a repetitive motion, his breathing altered in the specific way that said his airway needed management in the next 90 seconds. Patrick, who had stayed 20 minutes past his shift end for a handoff question, appeared in the doorway. I'll call Neuro. Call it. Get me diazepam 2 milligrams IV and the airway kit. She was already at Heaton's side, positioning him, tilting his head, assessing his breathing with 2 fingers on his carotid and her eyes on his chest. Get the attending. The next 14 minutes were the kind that didn't have room for anything outside themselves. Diazepam administered at 90 seconds, which was when Priya's counterpart from the medical team arrived with the crash cart they hopefully would not need. Heaton's seizure activity slowed and stopped at the 4-minute mark. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 88 and came back up to 94 with supplemental O2 and airway positioning. His pulse was elevated and irregular in the way that needed a cardiology consult immediately, not pending. The attending, Dr. Marcus Shin, arrived at the 6-minute mark and took over the assessment with a smooth handoff that good emergency medicine always looked like from the outside and felt like controlled chaos from the inside. Nora gave the medication timeline, the vitals history, the fever progression over the last 18 hours. Shin ordered an emergency CT and an EKG and 2 additional labs and moved Heaton to a monitored bay, with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this enough times that the efficiency was real and not performance. Nora stepped back. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. And then they shook later, in the break room or the parking lot or somewhere private, and she had long since stopped apologizing to herself for the shaking because the order of those 2 things was the right order. She was writing the incident documentation at the nurse's station when she became aware that Seth Rourke was still there. He had positioned himself against the far wall of the corridor and had not moved, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "He's stable," she said, without looking up from the documentation. "I know. I watched." She kept writing. "You positioned his airway before the kid arrived," Seth said. "Standard protocol. You called the diazepam dose before the attending confirmed it. I'd been monitoring his fever pattern for 36 hours. The seizure threshold was a foreseeable progression." She looked up. "I know my patients." Seth nodded slowly, not surprised exactly. More like someone assembling confirmation of something they'd been building toward without being able to name. "Damon said you knew what mattered," he said. "You told me that yesterday." "I know. I'm telling you again." He paused. "Because I didn't understand what it meant when he said it. Thought it was a compliment. I think now it was a description." Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her documentation. At 1330, Lieutenant Commander Rafferty took her formal statement in a conference room on the 4th floor. He was thorough, as advertised, 50 minutes of precise questions delivered in the measured cadence of someone who understood that the way a question was framed determined the quality of the answer. She told him everything she had told Seth, and several things she hadn't, because Rafferty asked differently. He asked her about Colonel Halverson specifically, about the structural assessment override, about the conversation she'd had directly with Halverson when she requested rescue mission clearance, and he'd denied it and classified the denial, about the names of the 4 volunteers who had gone back in with her. "Nguyen and Walsh," he said. "The 2 operators you evacuated, still active." "Last I knew, yes. They were present for the rescue attempt." "Yes. Have you been in contact with them?" "No." She paused. "I assumed they'd been advised not to contact me." Rafferty made a note. "Colonel Halverson retired 2 years ago with a commendation from the Operational Readiness Board. The officer who wrote that commendation was a Rear Admiral named Stokes, who was also the reviewing authority on the original Ironvale incident report." Nora looked at him steadily. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Rafferty said. "It isn't." He closed his notebook. "Not finished reorganizing. Miss Callahan, I want to be honest with you about the scope of what's developing here. Fragment with Specialist Rourke's markings combined with your documentation and Chief Rourke's corroborating statement is enough to formally reopen the Ironvale incident review. But a full investigation into Colonel Halverson and Admiral Stokes is a significantly larger undertaking. It will take time, it will not be quiet, and your name will be central to it. I know. You've been managing this information for 6 years. I want to understand why now." She looked at Rafferty. "Rex walked into my ward," she said. "I didn't choose the timing. The timing chose me." Rafferty nodded once. He understood operational reality. The way things happened, when conditions aligned, rather than when you planned them to. "One more thing," he said. He opened a different folder, slid a single document across the table. "This is a copy of your IG grievance from 6 years ago, the original." She looked at it. "I thought it was classified." "It was." He paused. "The classification was applied by Admiral Stokes." As part of the JAG inquiry authorization this morning, we pulled all classification actions associated with Ironvale documentation signed by Stokes in the 18 months following the incident. He tapped the document. There are 11 of them. Yours is one. The others are significant. Nora looked at the document for a moment without touching it. Nguyen and Walsh, she said slowly. Did they file anything? Rafferty met her eyes. That, he said, is the right question. He let the silence hold for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, their statements are part of the sealed materials. What I can tell you is that they are alive. They are cooperating, and they have been cooperating since a JAG contact reached them this morning. He paused. They've been waiting 6 years for someone to ask. Nora sat back in her chair. The 4.5 hours she had spent in that building. 3 hours past the withdrawal order. Nguyen with his fractured pelvis, and Walsh with the chest wound, both of them stable enough by the time she'd come back for them to argue that she shouldn't go. Both of them losing that argument. Both of them going with her anyway, because that was the kind of people they were. 6 years. All of them carrying it, separately, in different cities, in different commands. Carrying it in sealed files and unread letters and photographs kept face down on kitchen counters. How long, Nora said, until the formal investigations? Her pager went off again. She looked at the display. Not the ward. The duty officer's station. Direct line, which had a specific code she had not seen before. She looked at Rafferty. He was already looking at his own phone. My office, he said, and his voice had changed. The measured quality was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted into a faster register. He looked at Nora. Stay here. He stepped out. Nora sat in the conference room and looked at the copy of her IG grievance on the table in front of her and listened to the sounds of the corridor outside Rafferty's voice. Low and rapid. Words she couldn't make out. A pause. More words. Came back in 3 minutes. His face was controlled, but she'd spent the morning learning to read what lived underneath his control, the same way she'd learned to read Seth's. There's been a development, he said. What kind? Colonel Halverson. Rafferty sat back down. He was notified this morning that a JAG inquiry had been initiated referencing the Ironvale incident. Standard notification, he would have received it around 11 o'clock. A pause. He contacted Admiral Stokes' office 40 minutes ago. Nora went still. And then Rafferty said, he contacted someone at the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office. We don't know the exact content of the communication yet. 40 minutes after that contact, a reporter from a national military affairs publication submitted a formal records request referencing the Ironvale incident. Specialist Damon Rourke, and he paused. Your name. The conference room was very quiet. He's going public, Nora said. It appears he's attempting to control the narrative before the investigation goes further. Rafferty's jaw was tight, which means whatever he puts out will frame the incident in whatever terms are most favorable to him, using whatever classified adjacent information he can release without technically violating clearance. And it will be on record before we have the chance to mince. Before the investigation establishes the actual record, Nora finished. Yes, she looked at the IG grievance on the table. 6 years of preparation. Every document, every copy, every careful, patient, exhausting act of being ready in case the moment came. The moment had come, and someone had just tried to get ahead of it. She picked up the grievance document and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the significant 6 years of documented truth in a folder that had spent most of its existence classified under a dead admiral's signature. Then she looked at Rafferty and said, how fast can you get Nguyen and Walsh on a call? Rafferty made the call from the conference room, with Nora still sitting across from him, which told her something about how the calculus had shifted in the last 4 minutes. He didn't step out. He didn't ask her to leave. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number from memory, and when the line connected, he said, get me Nguyen and Walsh on a secure line in the next 30 minutes. Yes, both of them. Today. He hung up and looked at her. Nguyen is at Camp Lejeune, he said. Walsh separated from service 8 months ago. He's in Wilmington, 40 miles. Can you get Walsh physically here? Rafferty looked at the time. If he leaves now, then get him moving. She slid the IG grievance back across the table toward him. And I need my documentation released from classification today. All 11 of Stokes' classification actions. If Halverson is feeding a narrative to a reporter, I need the actual record available to contradict it before whatever he's putting out goes to print. Declassification of JAG-adjacent materials requires Rafferty. She said his name with the specific weight of someone who had been patient for 6 years and was now done being patient in the particular way that ran out. Halverson is a retired colonel with a commendation he doesn't deserve and a reporter's phone number. I am a nurse with 11 classified documents, 3 corroborating witnesses, a piece of physical evidence, and a 6-year-old IG grievance that someone buried to protect a cover-up. Tell me which of those 2 positions requires more urgency. He looked at her for a moment. I'll make another call, he said. He made 3. Nora sat and listened to the shape of them, without trying to parse the specific language, because the specific language was above her clearance level, and she had learned years ago that fighting clearance boundaries in real time was a waste of energy that could be spent on things she could actually affect. What she could parse was the tone, and the tone of all 3 calls was the tone of someone escalating upward through a chain with increasing speed. When he finished the 3rd call, he set his phone face down on the table. Classification review will take 4 hours minimum, he said. Flagged it as time-sensitive, and the duty authority has been notified. 4 hours. There's no faster path without a senior flag officer authorizing an emergency declassification. Requested it. That request will either come back approved or it will come back with an explanation of why it can't be approved, in which case we'll know exactly who in the current chain is still protecting Stokes's decisions. Nora sat with that for a moment. That's actually useful either way. Yes, Rafferty said, it is. Walsh arrived at Coastal Pines at 1612. Nora knew because Rafferty texted her a 1-line notification while she was finishing her shift documentation. She found him in the 4th floor conference room at 1625, a broad-shouldered man of 31, with a scar along his left jaw that hadn't been there 6 years ago, and the particular stillness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that their posture had adjusted to the weight. Stood up when she came in. Not formally, not at attention, nothing military about it. Just the instinct of a man who recognized someone and didn't know what else to do with his body in that moment. Callahan, he said. Walsh. She shook his hand. You drove fast. Rafferty made it sound like fast was appropriate. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated in the specific way of people who shared an experience that had never been fully discussed. I've been waiting for this call for 6 years. I know. I'm sorry it took this long. You filed the grievance, he said. I know you filed it. Nguyen and I both filed supporting statements separately, same week. We never heard anything back. Stokes classified them. Walsh's jaw tightened. Yeah, I figured it was something like that. He looked at the table. When Rafferty called this morning, I thought someone had died. Someone new. I didn't think it was this. Halverson is trying to get in front of it, Nora said. He's contacted a reporter. Walsh went still. He's going to try to reframe Ironvale. Yes, he's going to use Damon. Probably. He's going to make it look like an operational loss that was handled correctly. And revisiting it is what? Political. Disrespectful to the fallen. Walsh said it with a flatness that wasn't absence of emotion, but was emotion compressed, so tightly it had taken on a different texture. He used that line before. I heard him use it when a family attorney tried to get access to the incident file 2 years after. Nora looked at him sharply. Which family? Damon's. Walsh met her eyes. Seth Rourke hired an attorney about 2 years after Ironvale. Halverson appeared at a preliminary hearing and argued that revisiting the incident classification would be disrespectful to the memory of the fallen operator and potentially damaging to active intelligence assets. He paused. Case was dismissed. Seth doesn't know that, Nora said. Probably not. The attorney was advised to stop. Walsh looked at the window. Halverson was very good at making things stop. The door opened and Rafferty came back in with his laptop, and a second JAG officer, Nora, hadn't met a woman. Lieutenant Petra Holloway, with the focused manner of someone brought in specifically because the situation had gotten large enough to require 2 sets of hands. Nguyen was on a secure video line on Rafferty's screen, visible from the chest up, in a duty uniform, with the expression of a man who had been waiting since 7 that morning to reach this moment. Nguyen, Nora said. Callahan. He nodded at her through the screen. His voice was steady. Walsh made it? I'm here, Walsh said from across the table. A brief silence that had years in it. Okay, Nguyen said. Let's do this. What followed was 3 hours of formal recorded testimony that Nora participated in partly as witness and partly as subject, the 2 roles switching back and forth, with the fluid discomfort of a situation that didn't have a clean procedural category. Rafferty asked the questions. Holloway documented. Walsh and Wynne gave their accounts of Ironvale, the structural assessment, the entry decision, the collapse, the extraction, and then the rescue attempt that Halverson had classified before it was even complete. Wynne described, in precise operational detail, the moment Halverson had denied rescue clearance and ordered withdrawal. He had been on the ship, his pelvis stabilized, on enough medication to blur the edges of things, but not the center, and he had heard Halverson on the command channel say the words that Nora had also heard. She had written down verbatim in the documentation she'd kept for 6 years. Asset is non-recoverable. Extraction window is closed. Anyone returning to the site is doing so in violation of direct orders and will face appropriate consequence. Walsh described requesting to join the unauthorized rescue team and being told by Nora, with characteristic directness, that his chest wound made him a liability and that the most useful thing he could do was stay on the ship and not die. He had done both those things. He had also, 3 days later, submitted a formal statement to the commanding officer of the ship documenting what he had witnessed, Halverson's denial of clearance, the classification order, and the structural assessment override that had sent the team into a compromised building in the first place. That statement had been classified within 48 hours. Stokes. By 1,900, Rafferty had enough on record to formally expand the JAG inquiry from a complaint-adjacent review into a full criminal investigation referencing negligent command decision-making, abuse of classification authority, and obstruction of a formal grievance process. He said this to Nora and Walsh in the conference room, with the careful precision of someone who understood that this was the moment things being irreversible. Once I file the expansion tonight, he said, Halverson will be notified, and his legal representation will be formally engaged. He will no longer be able to speak to any reporter without that conversation becoming relevant to the investigation. He's already spoken to one, Nora said. Yes. But there's a difference between having a conversation with a reporter and having a conversation with a reporter while under active criminal investigation. The publication, if they're reputable, will pause. They're not reputable, Walsh said. Rafferty looked at him. Then we have a different problem. He filed the expansion at 1,923. Nora knew the exact time because she was sitting in the conference room when he submitted it, and she looked at her watch when he closed the laptop. The same way she looked at her watch when she administered time-sensitive medication, not out of anxiety, but because timestamps mattered, and she had learned that lesson by experiencing what happened when they were missing. She left the building at 2005. Not because she was done, she wasn't done. She suspected she wouldn't be done for weeks or months. This was the beginning of a process, rather than any kind of ending, but because she had a shift at 600, and the Marine in bed 3 needed a nurse who had slept. Seth was waiting outside, saying not at the entrance down the sidewalk, past the main doors at the edge of the parking lot, where the light from the facility ran out, and the evening took over. He had Rex with him, Rex on a short lead, moving slowly with the careful gait of an animal one day post-surgery, who had been cleared for gentle movement and was making the most of it. Nora stopped. Rex looked at her and wagged once not the exuberant full-body greeting of a healthy working dog, but the controlled, dignified acknowledgement of a dog who had recently had surgery and was conserving energy without abandoning manners. Supposed to be resting, she said. He's been resting all day, going insane. Seth looked at her. How did it go? Rafferty filed the expansion. Full criminal investigation. Seth's exhale was slow and controlled. Halverson, and potentially Stokes, depending on what the declassification review finds. She paused. Nguyen and Walsh gave full testimony. Walsh drove up from Wilmington? Yes. Seth looked at Rex for a moment. I didn't know they'd filed supporting statements after Ironvale. I didn't know about the attorney hearing either. Halverson appeared. I know, Walsh told me. So Halverson was actively working to contain it, Seth said, while I was spending 3 years pulling every string I had access to and hitting nothing. The anger in it was quieter than yesterday. Stilled. He made sure every door I tried was already closed. Yes. And my mother, she knew some of that, not all of it, but enough that she made a calculation about what telling me would do. He was quiet for a moment. Rex pressed against his knee. I've been angry at the wrong people for 6 years. Nora looked at him. You've been angry at people who had incomplete information. Different. Don't do that. Do what? Make it easier than it is. He looked at her directly. Accused you publicly. I gave Rex an attack command. Spent 6 years actively resenting a woman who went back into a collapsing building to try to bring my brother home. His jaw was tight. That's not a reasonable mistake. That's 6 years of choosing a version of events that let me stay angry, because staying angry was easier than sitting with the actual loss. Nora was quiet for a moment. The parking lot was half empty in the evening gray, the facility's lights behind them making long shadows. Rex sat down with the careful deliberateness of a dog, managing post-surgical discomfort and pretending not to. "You're right," she said. "It's not a reasonable mistake. It's a human one." He looked at her. "There's a difference," she said. "Reasonable mistakes are the ones you could have avoided with better information or better judgment. Human mistakes are the ones you make because grief doesn't give you good information or good judgment, and you were 29 years old, and your brother was dead, and someone handed you a report with a name on it." She paused. "I'm not excusing it. I'm categorizing it accurately." Seth looked at her for a long moment, then quietly. "You've had 6 years to work out how to say that. I've had 6 years to work out a lot of things. Does any of it, the working out, does it actually help?" She looked at Rex, who was watching a car navigate the parking lot with professional assessment, even in his diminished post-surgical state. "Some days," she said. "Not every day," he nodded. That was probably the most honest answer either of them had available, and they both understood it. Following morning brought the first consequence they could see, which was not the same as the first consequence. Halverson's attorney contacted Rafferty at 730 to request a delay in the formal notification process on grounds that his client required time to consult. Rafferty's response, which Nora heard about secondhand through a brief message at 900, was that the notification was procedurally complete, and the delay request was noted for the record, which was the JAG equivalent of no with documentation. At 1100, the military affairs publication that had received Halverson's contact published a brief statement on their website saying they were aware of a developing story related to a classified incident and were pausing publication pending verification of new information that had come to their attention. Nora saw this on her phone in the break room during a 12-minute window between a medication round and a family consult, and she read it twice to be sure she was reading it correctly, and then she put her phone in her pocket and went to do the family consult. At 1400, Commander Garrett called her to the duty office again. "The declassification review came back," Garrett said. She had a different file on her desk, this time thicker than before, with the specific density of documents that had been somewhere else for a long time and had recently traveled. All 11 classification actions applied by Admiral Stokes to Ironvale-related documentation have been reviewed and found to be outside the scope of legitimate operational security requirements. She paused. "That's the formal language. What does it mean in practical terms?" Nora said. "It means they were improperly classified. It means the classifications are being lifted. And it means that the reviewing authority has flagged the pattern. 11 classification actions on documents, all connected to the same incident, all applied within 18 months by the same officer as potentially constituting deliberate suppression of material facts in an active grievance process." "Potentially," Nora said. "The language is cautious because the investigation is open," Garrett said. "But yes." She looked at Nora directly. "Your IG grievance from 6 years ago is being formally reinstated. As of this morning, it is no longer classified. It is an active grievance on the official record." Nora sat with that for a moment. 6 years ago, she had walked into an IG office with documentation and left with a case number and a subsequent silence that lasted until this week. The case number had existed somewhere in a sealed system for 6 years, technically present, functionally buried. "The Ironvale Incident Review," Nora said. "Is that also open?" "It has been formally reopened as of 1100 hours this morning." Garrett paused. "There will be a board. Timeline is being established. Your testimony will be central to it." "I know. The board will also review the conduct of all personnel connected to the incident, including the classification decisions and the rescue attempt." Garrett looked at the file, including the recommendation that was written for Halverson 2 years after Ironvale by Admiral Stokes. "Stokes is still active," Nora said. "For now," Garrett said, and left it at that. The next 48 hours moved in the particular way that institutional processes moved when they had been initiated not quickly, because nothing involving military bureaucracy moved quickly, but with the relentless forward momentum of a system that, once properly activated, did not stop because someone preferred it to. Halverson retained a civilian attorney in addition to the Jaji-appointed counsel. The civilian attorney issued a public statement saying that Colonel Halverson stood by all decisions made in his career and that the current inquiry was politically motivated and disrespectful to the memories of service members who had given their lives. The statement was published on the attorney's website and quoted in 2 places online. By the end of that same day, Tam Nguyen's testimony, the portion that had been cleared for release, had been formally entered into the investigation record and summarized in a AG public notification that described the reopening of the Ironvale Incident Review and the expansion of the inquiry to include classification practices. The notification was brief and precise and said almost nothing in the way that official notifications said almost nothing, while still being significant enough that anyone who understood what they were reading would understand it. Seth read it. He sent her a message at 2230. Nguyen's testimony is on record. First time his name has been on anything official about Ironvale since they classified his statement. Nora read it in her kitchen and wrote back yes. A pause. Then, how are you holding up? She looked at the question for a moment. It was the same question she'd asked him 3 days ago in the ward doorway, and he had answered honestly, and honesty seemed like the appropriate return. Tired, she wrote back. But the right kind. The board convened its preliminary session 11 days after the JG inquiry expansion. Nora was not present for the preliminary session. It was administrative, structural, the board establishing its own parameters. But Rafferty briefed her afterward in the now familiar 4th floor conference room, which she had come to think of as her secondary office, in the way that certain spaces became associated with specific chapters of your life, whether you chose them for that or not. Halverson will appear before the board in 3 weeks, Rafferty said. Stokes has been placed on administrative review, pending the board's preliminary findings. He's been asked not to travel. He agreed to that. He didn't have a choice that didn't look significantly worse. Rafferty paused. There's something else. The board's preliminary review of the structural assessment documentation, the one that rated the Ironvale building as compromised before entry, found a second document, an amended assessment. Nora went still, amended, dated 6 hours before the operation. It rated the building as conditionally stable. Rafferty looked at her. It was signed by a structural engineer attached to the operational command. Engineer was a civilian contractor who retired from contract work 2 months after Ironvale. Halverson had the assessment changed, Nora said. The original assessment remains in the file. The amended one was placed over it, not replacing it, just placed on top of it in the physical file in a way that would make the amended version the first thing a reviewer saw. He paused. Someone kept the original. Who? The engineer. Kept a copy. Apparently, he'd kept it for 6 years without knowing whether it would ever matter. Rafferty looked at the table, called the board's administrative line the day after the public notification of the inquiry reopening. He said he'd been waiting for someone to open a door. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Not from pain. From the particular sensation of understanding, belatedly. How many people had been carrying pieces of this for 6 years in separate rooms, none of them knowing about the others? Halverson falsified the structural assessment, she said. The investigation will determine that formally. But the original document establishes that the building was known to be compromised and that the assessment was amended after the fact. He paused. Damon Rourke and that team were sent into a building that the operation commander knew was structurally unsound, and then he spent 6 years making sure no one could prove it. Conference room was very quiet. He's not going to survive the board, Nora said. No, Rafferty said. He isn't. She walked out of Coastal Pines at 1,800 that evening and found Seth in the parking lot again, not at the edge this time, at the main entrance, no wrecks. Just himself in civilian clothes, with the slightly hollowed look of someone in the middle of a process that was necessary and exhausting in equal measure. Rafferty told me about the structural assessment, he said. He told me today, too. Halverson sent them in, knowing the building was going to come down. Yes. Seth looked at the facility entrance for a moment. Damon knew. He'd seen the original assessment. He said it slowly, working it out as he spoke. That's why he did the math that morning. He knew the extraction parameters because he knew the building might not hold. And he was planning for it. Yes, Nora said. I think so. He planned for it, and he didn't tell the team, because telling them would have meant explaining how he'd seen a document he wasn't supposed to have access to, and that would have stopped the operation, and the intelligence target had a 6-hour window. Seth's voice had the quality of someone reciting facts to keep them organized, because if he stopped organizing them, the weight of them would be too much. He made a call. Yes, a Damon kind of call. Something moved through Seth's expression: grief. Yes, but under it something else. Pride, maybe. The specific ache of recognizing someone in the decision they made. He always did that. He'd see the whole picture and just absorb the cost of it himself. Nora nodded. Seth looked at her. The board is going to find what it finds. Halverson is going to face what he faces. And none of it, he stopped. None of it brings him back. No, she said, it doesn't. Is it enough? The accountability. Is it? I don't know, Nora said. I've thought about that question for 6 years, and I still don't have a clean answer. I think justice and grief are separate things. I think one of them is possible, and the other one just takes time. Or doesn't. Depending on the day. Seth looked at her for a long moment. Rafferty also told me something else, he said. The shift in his tone made her pay attention. The board's review of the classification actions, Seth said. They pulled all communication records associated with Stokes's classification decisions. Standard procedure when abuse of classification authority is being investigated. He paused. There are communications between Stokes and Halverson going back 2 months before Ironvale. They were planning the operation together. The intelligence target, the window, the entry point. Another pause. Structural assessment override was not Halverson acting alone. Stokes approved it. Nora looked at him. Stokes was the reviewing authority on the incident report, she said slowly. Yes, he reviewed his own decision, yes. Seth's jaw was tight. He approved sending the team into a compromised building, and then he reviewed and signed off on the incident report of what happened when the building came down. And then he classified every document that would have shown his own involvement. The parking lot evening settled around them, and Nora stood with this new piece of information and felt it lock into place with the others. The way structural elements locked, not perfectly, not without stress points, but into a configuration that finally bore the load of the actual truth. Rafferty needs to know you told me this, she said. He does know. He's the one who told me. Seth paused. He wanted me to tell you in person because he said the next part of this involves a decision you need to make. And he thought you should hear the context from someone who wasn't in a conference room with a recording running. She looked at Seth carefully. What decision? The board's findings, when they're finalized, will be a matter of military record. They'll be made public through the standard process, which means they'll be available, but not necessarily prominent. Not necessarily the version of events that reaches most people. He met her eyes. Rafferty has been contacted by 2 outlets, serious ones, established military affairs, reporting asking for a statement from the primary corroborating witness. Your name was specifically requested. Halverson's attorney will call it political. Yes, and Stokes has people who will say the same. Yes. Seth looked at her steadily. And you have the option of saying nothing. Letting the board process work. Staying out of the public record and letting the institutional result be whatever it is. Nora looked at the entrance to Coastal Pines. At the building she had walked into 3 years ago, carrying a face-down photograph and a 6-year-old IG grievance, and the very specific patience of someone who had decided to be ready when the moment came. Or Seth said. Or she agreed. She looked at him. I need to sleep on it, she said. He nodded. Rafferty needs an answer by 800 tomorrow. I know, she said. She drove home in the dark. Made food she tasted, this time, because some shift had happened in the last 48 hours that had made appetite return in the way it did when something that had been clenched for too long finally released. She sat at her kitchen table and she thought about Damon Rourke doing the math on an extraction helicopter. The morning he walked into a building he knew was compromised. She thought about Nguyen and Walsh carrying their statements in sealed files for 6 years. She thought about a structural engineer keeping a copy of an original document in a drawer somewhere, not knowing if it would ever matter, keeping it anyway. She turned the photograph face up. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Rafferty. He answered on the second ring. Callahan, she said, I have my answer. And before she could give it, Rafferty said, Callahan, there's something you need to know first. His voice had the particular quality she had come to associate with information that changed the shape of everything around it, and she held the phone and waited, and he said, Stokes just submitted a statement to the board's administrative office. Preemptive statement. A pause. He's naming you as the officer who falsified the rescue timeline documentation. He's claiming the classified rescue attempt didn't happen the way you described it. He's saying you were on the ship the entire time, that the unauthorized return is a fabrication, and that the documentation you've been holding for 6 years was altered after the fact to protect your own record. Kitchen was very quiet. He's saying I made it up, Nora said. Yes. And he has a witness statement attached. Rafferty paused. From someone who was on that ship, someone who says they saw you on the deck the entire time the rescue window was open. Nora's hand tightened on the phone. Who, she said. Rafferty said the name. Nora closed her eyes. It was someone she had trusted. Someone who had been there. Someone whose own statement, 6 years ago, had been one of the ones Stokes had classified, which meant Stokes had read it, had known what it contained, and had spent 6 years keeping it sealed until the moment he needed to use it differently. The photograph of Damon Rourke's team was face up on the kitchen counter, and the person whose name Rafferty had just said was standing in the second row, 2 people to the left of Damon, with the careful expression of someone who had made a different kind of calculation than the one she had made, and had been waiting, just like Slonsman, for the moment that calculation would matter. The name Rafferty said was Specialist First Class Owen Garrett. Not Commander Garrett, no relation. Different branch, different decade of service. Owen Garrett had been a logistics specialist attached to the operational command ship during Ironvale, 26 years old at the time, responsible for manifest documentation and deck access logs. He had been standing at the aft deck station when Nora had come back aboard with Nguyen and Walsh, and he had been there. She remembered his face specifically, the way you remembered faces from moments that burned themselves into you when she had turned around and gone back. She had looked at him when she passed him the second time. He had not tried to stop her. He had not said anything. He had just watched her go. She had thought in the 6 years since that his silence was the silence of someone who understood what she was doing. She understood now that she had misread it entirely. He was on Stokes's manifest team, Rafferty said. His performance evaluations for the 2 years following Ironvale were exceptional. Promoted ahead of schedule. Separated from service with a full commendation package. A pause. Stokes signed every evaluation. Nora looked at the photograph on the counter. Owen Garrett, second row, 2 left of Damon, with that careful expression. She had thought, when she'd looked at team photos over the years, that the carefulness was professionalism. She could see now it was calculation. He's saying, I never left the ship, Nora said. His statement says he was on deck access duty from 1,800 to 2,200 on the night in question, that all departures and returns were logged, and that your name does not appear in the departure log for that window. Because the departure log was his document to maintain, Nora said. Yes, he falsified the log. Possibly. Or removed an entry. Rafferty's voice was precise and controlled. The original log from that night was destroyed in a routine records purge 14 months after Ironvale, which was within standard records management protocol. A pause that had weight in it, except that the purge order was signed by Stokes. Kitchen was very quiet. So the log is gone, Nora said. The official log, yes. But, a brief pause. The ship's external security camera system logged all deck activity automatically, separate system from the manual manifest. The footage was archived digitally as part of standard naval record keeping and was not subject to the same purge order because it fell under a different classification of record. Rafferty paused again. Pulled it today. Nora's hand tightened on the phone. Callahan, you're on it. Both departures, both returns. Timestamp, deck position, full visual confirmation. His voice had changed, the measured quality still there, but underneath it something that was almost relief. Owen Garrett is also on it. Standing at his station when you left the second time, watching you go. She closed her eyes for 1 second. He knew the camera was there, she said. Almost certainly. Which means his statement to the board is not a misremembered account. It's a deliberate false statement submitted under oath to an active military investigation. Rafferty paused. That's a significantly different problem for him than Stokes probably anticipated when he asked Garrett to provide it. When are you presenting the footage to the board? Tomorrow morning, 7:30. Stokes's statement and Garrett's witness declaration have already been submitted to the board's record. Footage will be submitted as direct rebuttal. He paused. I'd like you there. I'll be there. She hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen for a long time, not doing nothing. She was thinking, which was never nothing for her. but which had the external appearance of stillness that people sometimes mistook for passivity. She was thinking about Owen Garrett on that deck, watching her leave, choosing in that moment not to stop her, and choosing in every moment for 6 years after not to say what he had seen. And she was thinking about Stokes, who had read Garrett's original classified statement, the accurate one, the one that confirmed she had left and had stored it like a resource, like something to be used when the moment required it, and had then called Garrett and told him what the new version needed to say. She was thinking about what kind of man spent 6 years waiting to use a person's silence against them. Then she stopped thinking about it because the answer was clear and didn't require further examination. And she made herself go to bed because 730 was not far away, and being exhausted in front of a military board of inquiry was not a version of this she was willing to accept. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. The board convened in a secure conference facility on the naval station adjacent to Coastal Pines, not the hospital itself, but the administrative complex connected to it by a covered walkway that smelled like industrial carpet and recycled air. Nora arrived at 715. Rafferty was already there, Holloway beside him, both of them with the focused pre-session energy of people who had reviewed their materials and were now simply waiting for the room to be ready. Walsh was there too, flown up overnight on Rafferty's request, still in civilian clothes, with the slightly unslept look of someone who had made a long trip on short notice and had no regrets about it. Seth arrived at 722. He looked at Nora across the room and nodded once. She nodded back. The board was 3 officers, a Navy captain named Delgado, who chaired, a Marine colonel named Briggs, whose first name was not Halverson's first name, but whose manner suggested he had sat on enough boards to be genuinely unimpressed by the process of being on a board, and a civilian oversight representative named Catherine Voss, who worked for the DoD Inspector General's office and carried herself with the specific authority of someone who understood that her presence in the room meant the stakes had passed a certain threshold. Stokes was present via secure video link. He looked, on the screen, like a man who had spent the night assembling confidence and had mostly succeeded. His attorney was seated beside the camera, visible at the edge of the frame. Halverson was physically present at the far end of the room with 2 attorneys and the specific posture of a man who had decided that his best available option was dignity and was working hard to maintain it. Owen Garrett was not there. He had been notified of the session and had sent word through an attorney that he was unwell and requested a postponement. Request had been denied. Delgado opened the session at 731 with the procedural language of a man who had done this many times and found efficiency more respectful than ceremony. He outlined the scope of the preliminary findings, the expanded inquiry parameters, and the purpose of the morning's session, which was to address the conflicting statements regarding the Ironvale rescue attempt timeline before the full board convened for testimony. Then Rafferty presented the footage. It ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It showed the aft deck of the command ship on the night in question, the timestamp in the lower right corner in the unchangeable format of automated security systems that did not care about manual logs or purge orders. It showed Nora Callahan leaving the ship, the first time with 2 wounded operators and a military working dog. Showed her returning. It showed her, 47 minutes later, leaving again, moving with the particular directional purpose of someone who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. Showed Owen Garrett at his station in frame, watching her go. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when something had just made an argument that did not require words. Stokes, on the screen, had gone a color that the video connection slightly distorted but did not conceal. His attorney leaned toward him and said something Nora couldn't hear. Stokes's expression did not change in response to whatever it was. Halverson was looking at the table. Delgado said, "The board notes that the footage has been authenticated by independent technical review and is being entered into the permanent record." He looked at the screen, at Stokes, Admiral Stokes. "The witness statement you submitted this morning contradicts this footage directly. The board requires your response." There was a pause. Stokes's attorney spoke into the frame. "Admiral Stokes reserves his right to respond through counsel." "That right is noted," Delgado said. The board further notes that a statement submitted to this board is submitted under the standards applicable to formal military proceedings, and that a materially false statement carries consequences separate from and in addition to the underlying matters under inquiry. Another pause. Stokes looked at the camera. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years learning to project authority and was discovering that authority was a coat you wore and not a thing you were, and that when you took the coat off in a room like this one, the person underneath it was just a person who had made bad decisions and then worse ones trying to cover them. "I would like to consult with my counsel," Stokes said. "The board will recess for 20 minutes, Delgado said. During the recess, nobody spoke much. Walsh got water from a side table and brought a cup to Nora without being asked. Took it. Seth stood near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, doing the controlled internal processing that she recognized because she did the same thing. Rafferty reviewed notes. Holloway updated documentation. When the board reconvened, Stokes's attorney delivered a statement on his behalf. Statement withdrew the previously submitted witness declaration from Owen Garrett. Statement indicated that Admiral Stokes had relied on a third-party account that he now had reason to believe was inaccurate. The statement offered no further elaboration. It was, Nora understood, the minimum retreat that could be executed without an immediate admission of guilt. It left Garrett exposed the inaccurate account, was now alone, and it repositioned Stokes as a man who had been misled rather than a man who had orchestrated the misleading. It was not a good strategy, but it was the only one left. Delgado looked at it for a moment after the attorney finished reading. The board notes the withdrawal, he said. The board also notes that the submitted statement was accompanied by Admiral Stokes's signature and attestation. Question of what Admiral Stokes knew at the time of submission is within the scope of this inquiry. He looked at Stokes on the screen. We'll proceed. What followed was 2 hours that Nora sat through with the particular endurance of someone who had already done the hard part and was now in the procedural tail of it necessary, important, but no longer the thing that required everything she had. The board reviewed the structural assessment documents, the original and the amended version. They reviewed the classification history. They reviewed the rescue attempt timeline as established by the footage, by Nora's testimony, by Walsh's account, and by the corroborating evidence from the ship's medical log showing that Nguyen and Walsh had been treated for field injuries consistent with a combat rescue environment during the window in question. Halverson was asked 3 times about the structural assessment. The first time, he said he had acted on the best available information. The second time, after the original assessment was placed in front of him, he said he believed the amended assessment represented a genuine re-evaluation. The third time, after the reviewing engineer's name was raised, and the board noted that the engineer had confirmed the original assessment remained his professional conclusion, Halverson said he needed to consult with his attorneys. He was given that opportunity. When he returned, he did not offer a revised statement. He sat at the table with his attorneys and said nothing further about the structural assessment, which was its own kind of statement. At 1240, Delgado recessed the board for the day. He indicated that preliminary findings would be issued within 10 working days and that the full board for testimony would convene within 30. He thanked all parties for their attendance and said it with the tone of a man who understood that some things he thanked people for were not things he was actually grateful for. Stokes's connection ended without ceremony. The screen went dark. Halverson's attorneys gathered their materials with the careful efficiency of people managing a situation they had not anticipated managing this thoroughly. Halverson himself sat for a moment after they began packing, looking at the table, and then he stood slowly, the way older men stood when their joints reminded them of time, and walked out of the room without looking at Nora. She watched him go. She felt not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied a clean completion, and this was not clean. It was correct. There was a difference, and she had spent enough time with grief and justice both to know that the difference mattered. Walsh found her outside the room afterward. "You okay?" he said. "I'm going to have to stop answering that question," she said. "That means yes. That means I don't know yet, but I'm functional." She looked at him. "You drove 4 hours on 12 hours' notice to sit in a room for 2 hours. I drove 4 hours because 6 years ago you came back into a building for a man who'd already ordered you to leave. And after that, I figured I could manage a drive." He shrugged. But it wasn't casual. It was the movement of someone who didn't know how to accept the weight of what he was actually saying. So he moved instead. Nguyen wanted to be here in person. He's putting in for emergency leave to come down for the full testimony session. Tell him he doesn't have to. He knows he doesn't have to. It's not why he's coming. She understood that. She nodded. The preliminary findings came in 9 days, 1 day ahead of schedule, which was either institutional efficiency or someone's judgment that waiting served no additional purpose. Nora received a formal notification from Rafferty's office on a Thursday morning, read it at her kitchen table with coffee that had gone slightly cold while she was in the shower, and then read it again to be certain she was reading it accurately. The preliminary findings of the Ironvale Incident Review Board stated that the structural assessment submitted to the Operation Command prior to the Ironvale extraction had been materially altered in a manner inconsistent with the original professional determination of the assessing engineer, and that this alteration had been made with the knowledge and authorization of then Colonel Briggs Halverson and then Rear Admiral William Stokes. The findings further stated that the classification actions applied to Ironvale-related documentation in the 18 months following the incident were outside the scope of legitimate operational security requirements and constituted deliberate suppression of material facts relevant to an active grievance process. The findings stated that the record of the Ironvale extraction, as it pertained to the conduct of then medical specialist Nora Callahan, was materially incomplete and required formal correction. The record was corrected. It stated that Specialist Callahan had evacuated 2 critically wounded operators and 1 military working dog under direct orders from the ranking operator on site, and that she had subsequently returned to the extraction zone in an unauthorized rescue attempt that lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes beyond the formal withdrawal order, in direct contravention of command instruction and in full awareness of the personal and professional consequences. The corrected record noted that this action, while unauthorized, reflected the conduct of an individual whose commitment to the personnel under her care extended beyond the formal boundaries of her orders, and that the absence of this information from the original record had been the result of deliberate institutional action rather than oversight. Specialist Damon Rourke was noted in the corrected record as the ranking operator who had made the decision to prioritize the evacuation of critically wounded personnel and whose conduct in those final minutes reflected the highest standards of the service to which he had belonged. Nora put the notification down on the table. She picked up the photograph. She looked at Damon Rourke's grin in the second row, and she thought about what he had done with a piece of wire and a sharp edge in a collapsing building, and she thought about how long that small scratched mark had traveled to reach the people it needed to reach. And she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to a photograph that would come close to what she wanted to say. She turned it face up and left it there. Owen Garrett was formally charged with making a false official statement to a military board of inquiry. The charge carried consequences that would unfold through their own separate process, not quickly, not cleanly, but forward, which was the only direction that mattered. His commendation package was placed under review. He had retained an attorney and was cooperating with the investigation in the particular way of someone whose cooperation was now the best available leverage they had left. Stokes submitted a formal statement through his attorney acknowledging that the Garrett witness declaration had been inaccurate and that he bore responsibility for its submission. The statement stopped short of admitting that he had known it was inaccurate when he submitted it. The board had the footage of the deck. The board had the original classified version of Garrett's statement, which had been accurate. The board had the 6-year pattern of classification actions. Statement's careful language did not change any of those things. He was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending the full board's findings and referred to the DoD IG for a separate of his classification authority usage. Commendation of Halverson was formally flagged as part of the record under review. Halverson faced a formal court of inquiry. The process was not swift military proceedings, never were, but it was thorough in the way that proceedings became thorough when the evidence had been accumulating for 6 years in sealed files, and the people who had been keeping it had finally been given a room and a question and the reasonable expectation that the question would be heard. He was ultimately found to have violated the standards of command responsibility applicable to the structural assessment decision and the subsequent classification actions, and to have acted in a manner that caused direct and documented harm to the personnel involved in the Ironvale operation and to the formal grievance process initiated by one of those personnel. The findings did not use the word coward. They didn't need to. The language they used was precise and official and would exist in the record for as long as the record was kept, which was longer than careers, and longer than reputations, and longer than the commendations that people wrote for each other when they thought no one was watching. Nora was not present for Halverson's final hearing. He was working. Ward 7, a Tuesday, a post-surgical recovery patient with a fever that needed monitoring, and a family member who needed the same information explained 4 different ways. The ordinary work. The work that had never stopped being the work, regardless of what was happening around it. She found out the result from Rafferty's message at 1,700. Read it in the break room on her phone, and went back to complete her end-of-shift documentation. Marcus at the desk looked at her when she came out. "You good?" he said. "Yeah," she said. And this time she meant it without qualification. Seth came by Coastal Pines on a Friday afternoon 6 weeks after the preliminary findings, not during her shift, but after she was in the parking lot, keys in hand, when she saw him at the edge of it with Rex. Rex was moving well now. The surgery site had healed cleanly, Priya reported, and the compensation gate was gone, replaced by the full-weight confident stride of an animal who had been carrying something he wasn't meant to carry, and had been relieved of it. "He had his final veterinary clearance this morning," Seth said. "I know. Priya told me." Rex came toward her with the focused greeting of a dog who has determined that someone belongs in his circle and acts accordingly. She put her hand on his neck, and he pressed into it with the familiar weight that she now associated with something she didn't have a clean word for: continuity, maybe. The fact that some things survived. "The board issued its full findings yesterday," Seth said. "I read them. Your name is on the corrected record. Yes, Damon's name is on it too. The right version." He looked at Rex. "I had a conversation with Nguyen last week. He told me, he said, when you came back for the second time, when you passed him on the deck going out again, he said you looked like someone who had already decided and just needed the steps between the deciding and the doing." Seth paused. He said he's never seen anything like it in 15 years of service. Nora looked at Rex. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. What makes it what it is." She looked at Seth. He had the appearance of a man who had been through something significant and was on the other side of it, which was not the same as being finished with it, but was its own kind of progress. The disciplinary review of his conduct in Ward 7 had resulted in a formal reprimand in his service record and a 60-day restriction from K9 handling duties, both of which he had accepted without contest, both of which were now complete. He had done the mandatory counseling without treating it as a box to be checked, which his counselor had noted, and which Nora knew because Seth had told her the slightly uncomfortable directness of someone practicing honesty rather than just performing it. "What happens to Rex?" she asked. "He's been cleared for adoption." Seth paused. "The unit offered me first consideration. Given the history, are you going to take it?" He looked at Rex for a moment. Rex looked back at him with amber patience. "I've been going back and forth on it," Seth said. "Whether I deserve it." Rex doesn't think in those terms. "I know." He looked at her. "That's actually what made me decide." He paused. "Yeah, I'm taking him." She nodded. They stood in the parking lot for a while, not filling the silence with things that didn't need to be said. The Virginia Coast evening was the kind that came in the fall specific and brief. The light going orange before it went gray, the salt and jet fuel smell of the facility's particular geography. Rex sat between them and watched the parking lot with professional attention. "There's something I want to ask you," Seth said. "Okay." The board's corrected record, Rafferty said, "There's a process for formal recognition of conduct. Not a medal, nothing like that. A formal acknowledgement in the service record for personnel who are no longer active." He looked at her. "Your discharge record. The way it reads right now, it references Ironvale with the incomplete original account." "I know. It can be corrected. The same way the incident record was corrected." He paused. Rafferty said he's already initiated the request. "But he wanted me to ask you if you wanted your name on it. The acknowledgement. Publicly." She thought about this. She had thought about it in various forms. For 6 years, what it would mean to have the record, say the correct thing, whether she needed it to, whether the truth of what she had done was diminished by the absence of official recognition, or whether it existed independent of what any document said about it. Truth was, she had gone back. She had done that in the dark, in a compromised structure, past the point where orders said to stop, because Damon Rourke had told her to leave, and she had left, and the leaving had been the right call, and it had still felt like the wrong thing, and she had needed to know she had tried everything. That had been true 6 years ago when no document confirmed it. true now when the footage showed it. The document catching up to the truth was not the thing that made it true. But the document mattered for other reasons. It mattered because Damon's name deserved to be on a correct record. It mattered because Nguyen and Walsh had carried their accurate accounts in sealed files for 6 years. It mattered because the next person who found themselves in a collapsing building following a correct order that felt like the wrong thing should not have to spend 6 years wondering if anyone would ever look at the footage. Yes, she said, put my name on it. Seth nodded. Rex stood up, shook himself once with the dignified efficiency of a dog concluding a rest period, and looked between them with the amber-eyed assessment of an animal, deciding that the current configuration of humans was acceptable. He likes you, Seth said. He has good judgment. He always has. He paused. He found you before I did. In the ward. He recognized you the moment he came through the door. I know. How long do you think he remembered? Nora looked at Rex. At the dog who had carried a piece of Ironvale in his shoulder for 6 years, who had pressed his head against her chest in a hospital ward, and cried the specific cry of an animal who has been waiting, who had been trained to attack, and had chosen something else entirely. He never forgot, she said. She drove home in the October dark, made dinner from scratch for the first time in weeks, something that required attention, and produced something good, and ate it at the kitchen table, with the photograph face up beside her plate. Team, the desert Damon's grin. Rex at his feet looking directly into the camera. Nora at the edge of the frame, not quite smiling, squinting into sun. She had spent 6 years looking at that photograph in stolen moments in the dark, face down, most of the time, because face down was the version she could live with. She had spent 6 years being the person on the edge of that frame in all the other frames too, the edge of the ward, the edge of the official record, the edge of the story that other people told about what had happened at Ironvale, while she carried the correct version in sealed documents in a fireproof box under her bed. She was not on the edge of the frame anymore. She was not the person who had been called a coward in a hospital corridor and hadn't defended herself because the truth required a room with a closed door. And she had understood, even then, some truths had to be told correctly, or they became ammunition for the people who needed them to be wrong. She was not the person who had walked into Coastal Pines 3 years ago with a face-down photograph and a patience that had looked, from the outside, like someone who had made peace with what had happened. She had not made peace with it. She had never made peace with it. She had simply refused to let the absence of peace become the absence of function. And she had stayed ready. And when Rex had walked through the ward doors and looked at her across a room full of frozen people and done what he had done, she had met the moment the way she had spent 6 years preparing to meet it, without flinching. That was the thing, she thought, that people misunderstood about quiet strength. They thought it was the absence of fear, or the absence of doubt, or the particular cleanliness of someone who had sorted their own experience into manageable categories. It wasn't any of those things. It was the decision, made in some ordinary moment when nothing was happening yet, that you would not let what had been done to you determine what you did next. It was the decision made again every morning for 6 years, in a parking lot, in a break room, at a kitchen table, with a photograph you couldn't yet look at directly, and then one day you could. Photograph and looked at Damon Rourke's grin and thought about the math he had done on an extraction helicopter and the wire he had marked in a collapsing building and the 4 words he had sent home in the only carrier available. To him, an animal who had not forgotten and had not failed and had traveled 6 years through sealed files and a surgery suite to deliver the thing it was carrying to the people who needed it. The record was correct now. The men who had falsified it were facing the consequences of having done so, not cleanly, not quickly, but forward and publicly, and in a manner that would exist in the record longer than their commendations. People who had carried pieces of the truth in separate rooms for 6 years had finally been in the same room, and the room had been a board of inquiry, and the board had done what it was supposed to do when given accurate information and the footage to confirm it. None of it had made Damon Rourke less dead. None of it would. That was the part that no official record corrected and no formal acknowledgement addressed. The part that Seth was working through in counseling and would keep working through for longer than that. Part that Walsh had driven 4 hours for, and Nguyen was requesting emergency leave for. The part that Rex had expressed in the only language available to him by pressing his head against a woman's chest in a hospital ward and refusing, for one specific moment in 6 years of training, to do the thing he had been told. Grief did not resolve, it redistributed. Found a different place to live in you, a shape that you could function around while still knowing exactly where it was. And you carried it forward because forward was the only direction that meant anything. Nora Callahan had gone back into a collapsing building for a man who had ordered her to leave. She had delivered 2 wounded operators to a ship and turned around and gone back into the dark. She had filed the grievance and kept the copies and taken the position at Coastal Pines and turned the photograph face down for 3 years and kept it anyway. And when the moment came, she had been ready, and the readiness had looked like patience from the outside and had felt like something else entirely from the inside. She set the photograph down, face up, in the center of the kitchen table. Then she cleared her dinner plate, washed it, dried it, put it away. She was working tomorrow. The Marine in bed 3 had been discharged. There were new patients and new charts, and the ordinary ongoing work of a critical care ward in a military medical facility, where people came with the specific injuries of having been in places that broke bodies, and where someone needed to be present and unafraid and ready for whatever the next morning brought through the door. She turned off the kitchen light. The photograph stayed face up in the dark. Some people spend their lives being told they are less than what they are. They are told it quietly and officially and in sealed documents, and they carry the weight of the wrong version for years, because the right version has nowhere to go. What those people know, what Nora Callahan knew, standing in a collapsing building while the ceiling came down in stages, is that the truth doesn't need permission to be true. Just needs someone willing to keep it until the room is ready to receive it. The room was ready. She had made it ready. That was enough.